All right, Diallo here. The 2022 FIFA World Cup is looming large, and the tournament is due to kick off on the 20th of November. Now, the plight of migrant workers in Qatar has been an issue of concern for many rights organizations since Qatar was awarded the rights to host the tournament back in 2010. And Amnesty International have released their latest reality check report outlining some of the reforms made by the Qatari state to the Cafala system and also the many lingering issues that remain. Now, I'm speaking to Amnesty International's head of economic and social justice, Stephen Cockburn, about the reforms that have been made, the many lingering issues that remain, the calls for a compensation fund for workers, and also FIFA's role within all of this. So, Stephen, to start off, let's define the Cafala system first and what it actually entailed prior to the advent of the first reforms.
So yeah, the Cafala system is common across most Gulf countries. It essentially means sponsorship in Arabic. Workers will come from other countries and they'll be sponsored by an employer in Qatar, and the employer would have, I guess, control and permission over their entry, their visa, but also their residence permit. And until the last few years in Qatar, that also meant that a worker couldn't change job or even leave the country without permission of their employer. So that the employer had real major power over the worker, and it meant that that an abusive employer could maintain that control quite easily, and a worker who may not have been in good working conditions or may have been had their salaries paid had very limited ability to escape that abuse and limited ability to negotiate better conditions because they were essentially, at the mercy of that employer.
Yeah, and reforms have been made to the system. Can you maybe just talk us through the basic reforms that have been made, and maybe we'll get into the lingering issues that still exist, because there's a issue of things being, laws set in place on paper, but in reality on the ground, as Amnesty have outlined, there are a lot of issues. But in terms of the major reforms that were made, first, what are they?
So over the last couple of years, two major reforms in relation to the Cafala system. So there's been a whole range of reforms, first of all, including a new minimum wage, some new health and safety legislation. And in relation to the Cafala system, the two big changes have been that, one, the requirement to get the permission of your employer to leave the country, called an exit permit, that has been abolished, and that the requirement to get the permission to change jobs, which was called a no objection certificate, has been abolished, with a few restrictions remaining. Which has made quite a big difference to a lot of people. But we, of course, still hear plenty of stories about people who are restricted because of some remaining restrictions in place, or because of debt that they may have, or the fact that some of the reforms may not be enforced in certain places.
Yeah, and in regards to how Amnesty have raised issues with the Qatari state, what organs of the state do you generally approach when there are issues, and in terms of trying to get them resolved?
Yeah, so we communicate quite regularly with the Ministry of Labour in Qatar, as well as the sort of General Communications Office, but it's the Ministry of Labour that we will work with a lot, and we have for more than a decade been raising cases of forced labour, cases of unpaid wages, cases of unsafe unsafe working conditions and uninhabitable accommodation. So we've been raising those cases for more than a decade, and we continue to do so, and also trying to push them on the reforms to make sure that they are not just on paper, but are actually enforced in practice as well.
Yeah, and from my understanding, a lot of, in regards to the laws that govern migrant workers in Qatar, that a lot of it is under the auspices of the Interior Ministry. Would that be right? And that maybe does add an extra layer of an issue in regards to trying to raise some of the problems that exist there.
That's right. So a number of the reforms that are passed are by the Ministry of Labour, but some of the way that the things are governed are through the Ministry of Interior. So one of the key problems that many migrant workers, including domestic workers, has been this a charge that employers will do called absconding, where An employer may want to change jobs, may not be allowed to, but has decided, well, I'm going to leave. I want to escape this. I'm not being paid properly. I'm not being treated properly, or I've got a better job. And the employer may do a sort of malicious charge, file a malicious of absconding, since they've escaped, which is and that would lead to the sort of police and the Ministry of Interior could detain them and even deport them from the country because of that, and cancel their residence ID. So there is a need for coordination in the approach between the Ministry of Labour and the Interior Ministry to make sure that migrant workers are treated as they've been promised to be.
Yeah, and in your reports, the reality check reports that have been released more or less annually, and I think the most recent one is also coming out here this week on the 20th of October. When you read through it, and obviously Amnesty does interviews either in person or remotely. How big a risk is it for those workers actually and also for your investigators to operate?
So Qatari authorities do allow us to go and do research, but there are restrictions, and journalists face a lot of restrictions in the country as well, especially regarding filming. So there have been cases of journalists who wanted to film in Qatar and film workers' accommodation who have been detained and arrested in Qatar. So there are certainly risks to that. There are many workers who don't feel comfortable speaking, and certainly don't want to do it publicly. Some are willing to talk to you because they are frustrated with their situation. I think we find often cases the people who are most willing to speak to you are those who they've got nothing left to lose. They haven't been paid for 6 months. They're stuck. They're trying to escape, so they want to talk to you. They want to find a solution. They want to raise their cases, and unfortunately, there are a lot of those cases. So there are risks. There was, for example, a security guard who was arrested last year and detained for quite some time, because he was blogging about different issues, and so there are restrictions on the way people speak out, and of course, employers themselves may retaliate against workers who do so, and that's a major risk to workers, and it's a major deterrent for them doing so. And so there's a need to improve working conditions, but there's also a need to improve sort of freedom of expression in the country, and also the right to trade unions. Trade unions are still banned. Despite the reforms, there are still no trade unions allowed in Qatar, which means workers don't have the ability to gather together and negotiate in safety together.
Yeah, and if we look at Amnesty's reality check report in 2021, and which there were a number of issues raised, and also a call for urgency in terms of dealing with them, and then with the report that's coming out this week, has there been much progress at all in that span, especially considering that a lot of the migrant workers are working on projects that have to do with the World Cup, which is only now about a month away?
So there've been progress in a couple of areas, I'd say. I think the compensation that workers who've lost their wages, the sort of access to justice and sort of labour tribunals has improved, and that there is more wages being compensated, but it's still quite difficult for workers to get it. But that's certainly that has got better. And I think the implementation of the abolition of the exit permit and to some degree the ability to change jobs has improved as well. There's still gaps, but I think there has been some progress there. Where I think we've seen much more limited progress has been in investigations of deaths of workers. So still, most workers who die in Qatar, their causes of death are not investigated, and that means that if it's been work related, we don't know, and it also means that families don't get the compensation, which is really a significant and major issue. There's been that remains a huge issue. So does domestic workers. There's been a law, an improved law in there since 2017, but really not implemented. The research that we've done shows that the vast majority of domestic workers work still between 14 and 18 hours a day without a day off is the norm, which is, it's illegal as well as absolutely unacceptable, but there's not really been much progress on that. And that's some of the most vulnerable workers in the country, and is really serious. And we still see lots of cases of forced labor especially in certain sectors like the private, like among security guards, cleaners, and certain. So I think there's been some progress in some areas, but the reality is that abuses still persist. They're still prevalent, especially in certain sectors and in certain areas, because laws that have been in place for a long, long time just simply aren't enforced enough.
And when we talk about maybe the limits on enforcing it, and maybe some of the reasons why certain sectors of society in Qatar don't want change to happen, are we looking at it as more like the business community, a sense of backlash from them against reforms because again it goes against their interests?
I think there are certainly fears. I mean, like in any country where there's reforms, big reforms happening, there are always interests that will oppose that. And of course, commercial interests are touched in Qatar by changing labor laws. So there is a resistance in some. I think there's also a resistance to accountability. So there was a resistance to holding people criminally responsible for exploitation. And that's a really big issue. There's very few people who are criminally prosecuted for exploiting workers. That absolutely needs to change. I think there is a quite big constituent in Qatar that supports the reforms too, whether that's politically or in the business environment, because it's the right thing to do for workers, but actually to have a more modern economy does need, and have a sort of more skilled labor force and a more mobile labor force. It does require that ability to change jobs and allow people to improve their conditions, and it should be a good thing for the country as well as a good thing for workers. But of course, there are some people that oppose that in the short term.
Yeah, as you've outlined in a couple of cases there, enforcement is the major issue. You mentioned the NOC, or the non-objection certificate. So this was something that isn't, in theory, it's not supposed to be required now. But as you found in the reports that Amnesty have put out, it's still, some employers are still asking for that.
Some employers are still asking for that, yes, and putting barriers in place. And then there are others that are that I mentioned before may file absconding charges if someone leaves without that permission. So the law should permit people to leave, but there are practical barriers in place for that that may prevent some people from taking advantage of that. That could be resolved. We could get rid of the laws around absconding, and we could simplify the processes for that. And I think it's really important that the Qatari authorities do that, so that the reforms do what they're meant to do for people.
And what do you feel maybe is actually preventing the Qatari state from, maybe particularly on that absconding law, for example, because again, it could be something that could be done in the space of a few months, one would imagine. So what do you feel is actually preventing that from happening?
I think there probably still is a resistance in some quarters about giving up too much control over workers. So there has clearly been a big change in terms of the changes in the Cafala system, but there is still resistance to giving workers too much power and too much control, as they would perceive it. Whereas in reality, these are their rights. It's their rights to be able to move freely between jobs. It should be their right to be able to organize and have trade unions to protect their interests. But of course, the country has been based on the Cafala system for so long that fear and that fear of opening up too much may still be there. I think that they should have the confidence to be able to see that the reforms were the right choice for Qatar, and to really see them through, and the country will benefit as well as workers.
Yeah, and one other thing that's sort of related is the the non-compete clause, which exists in industries across the world, but the way it seems to be applied in Qatar, it's in industries where it's not particularly relevant. Employers use it as another means of basically preventing their workers from changing jobs.
Yeah, I think the issue often is that also when things are defined quite broadly, it's very easy to interpret them in a very, and this you'll see in many countries. If a legislation or law is broadly interpreted, it provides a lot of space for people to implement that in a way that was not intended, or in a way that is not favorable to workers, and that could be an example of that.
Yeah, and then in regards to the workers' deaths that you mentioned, so these are more often than not people who have actually had health checks before they come over, and many of the documented cases they're in their 30s, no major health issues, and then it's just very interesting how their deaths are then recorded with natural causes often being used, and also then cardiac arrest, and bears no real link to the actual the foundation of their health previous to going there.
That's right. So there's a really, the question of how many workers have died in Qatar, since the World Cup was ordered has been hugely controversial, hugely contested. The figures, sometimes go in many different directions, and the heart of that, there's probably two real important facts that we know. One is that workers have been working in unsafe conditions in the extreme heat and without inadequate protection for the vast majority of the last decade. That is starting to improve, but not enough. And that there will be, and there are studies showing that will have led to an excess number of deaths among certain professions and nationalities. There's an important study on the poorly construction workers, for example, that shows that there could have been hundreds of deaths prevented with the right kind of prevention measures. And the other important fact is that Qatar simply doesn't carry out proper investigations of deaths when they occur. So as you say, they're often down to cardiac arrest or natural causes or causes that the sort of medical experts that we speak to when we've done our research say are meaningless. It just means they've died. And what is actually needed is an investigation. If someone previously healthy of a healthy age has collapsed at night away from their work site, but maybe back at the accommodation from respiratory failure, from heart attack, there needs to be an investigation in why. What were their working conditions? Could that have been a cause? And if that's the case, the assumption is that it should be work-related. Measures have to be put in place to prevent that, but also families have to be compensated. And it's really tragic, and it's really unfair on the families who've lost both a breadwinner, a family member, and their financial security has been torn apart.
Yeah, and obviously the World Cup was awarded way back in 2010 by FIFA, and they've sort of been in the eye of the storm when it comes to some of the criticism. So in regards to Amnesty International or other rights bodies, when they're raising these concerns with FIFA, similarly to how you raise concerns to the organs of the state in Qatar, what's the organ within FIFA that you would generally go to? And then what is the general tone of response and maybe the sense of urgency that follows after?
Yeah, so we have regular dialogue with this human rights team within FIFA, the human rights department, but also we appeal directly to FIFA president, to Gianni Infantino, and others to raise it at the highest level as well. We always, FIFA has accepted that it's got a human rights responsibility. It's got a human rights policy. It's starting to try and improve the way it does things. But we have always kind of highlighted the fact that we feel they've been too hands-off in Qatar in terms of the working conditions around their stadiums, and that's we've found abuses on World Cup sites. We felt that they have not been strong enough in sort of on the broader range of projects around that are essential to the world, like the metro, the highways, things that FIFA don't control but are important, that are essential for their tournament. We feel they need to be stronger in how they are getting Qatar to enforce better standards on that. And then the other thing is we feel they have done nothing really to make amends for the violations that have taken place over the last decade. And so we've been running a campaign with other organizations to set up a compensation fund to use some of the revenues for the World Cup, to set up a compensation fund for workers who have paid recruitment fees unfairly, who have lost wages, or even families of workers who've lost lives. They could do something real and practical for workers for doing that. And so we are constantly raising with them, and we are waiting to hear what the response is.
Yeah, and the compensation fund that you mentioned, it's $440 million US. It's probably fair to say that's at the lower end of the scale of in regards to what maybe if we're looking at figures and what the true level of compensation should be, it probably would be much higher, but that's sort of the lower end of the scale, I imagine.
So what we've said is that we want as a starting point for FIFA to ring fence the amount equivalent to the prize money they're giving to teams in the World Cup, which is $440 million, to put that in the fund to start it. But the actual amount that was used would actually be estimated based on people's claims on a more deeper analysis of what needs to be compensated, how many people, etc. And also the Qatar needs to contribute to that. So it is FIFA's responsibility to an extent, but it's also Qatar's responsibility. So we would expect that Qatar would also contribute to that fund in a large way to be able to do so. So yeah, if we're going to compensate every abuse that's taken place, it would be more than that. But of course, it needs a it needs a real process to define how that would work, how much it would cost, and how people could access it.
And so far, how responsive have FIFA been to that? Because as such, there hasn't been anything announced as of yet. We might talk about the football associations and that might be one route to try and push FIFA in that direction. But how have you found the response so far from FIFA itself?
So, we've been talking to FIFA about this. We first wrote to FIFA, to President Infantino 5 months ago. We've not had a reply to that letter, so we've not had an official reply to that. We understand that they are considering it. They said last week at a meeting that there was something that they were seriously considering progressing. That was a vice president of FIFA. So we know it's being discussed. We know it's being raised with them. We know that others are raising it with them, whether that's sponsors or football associations as well. But they've, 4 or 5 weeks left of the World Cup. They've not made an announcement. They've not made a commitment. It's got stuck somewhere. It needs some leadership from Gianni Infantino to say we're going to do this. We don't need all the details. We don't need don't have an exact plan of how it will work, but it's a commitment that we're going to do it, that we're going to set up an expert group, that we are going to study how the best way to make this happen, and that they'll fulfill their responsibilities. And they will set aside some money for it. I'm hopeful something will happen, but time is running out, and we do need to see leadership from FIFA, because there's a huge momentum now calling for it, whether it's from football fans, whether it's from sponsors, whether it's from football associations, from former players, and they're not responding yet, and we need to see more.
Yeah, because UEFA working group, it was last week in a meeting, raised it with FIFA. I think that might be potentially the meeting you were referring to there. But there's also a need, obviously, for some of the football associations around the world. Now, some of them, like the English FA, like the Norwegian, the Dutch, the Germans, have sort of, without maybe officially announcing anything, they have sort of pushed it in the right direction. But it seems, I would imagine, from an Amnesty International point of view, that is not enough as of yet, and it probably needs to be a bit more global.
Yeah, we'd like to see more for sure. I mean, it's been, in the last month, there's been a big shift. We've had, I think, 7 or 8 football associations, the most recent being the USA, which obviously the next host of the World Cup, just came out on Monday, saying that they would support it as well. But yeah, so there's, in a short space of time, we've had a huge growth in support for this idea. We do need that. We would like to see that from other parts of the world as well, and from other football associations to speak out, because it's in everyone's common interest, and it's in everyone has a responsibility for this. Football associations will profit, they'll make money from the World Cup, and they need to play a role in making sure that it's not tainted by abuse, and that something positive can come out of this as well.
Yeah, as you outlined, there were a number of sponsors that have actually supported some big name corporate sponsors. Now, FIFA have 14 of them, and AB, InBev, Budweiser, Coca-Cola, Adidas, McDonald's have all agreed that the compensation fund is something that needs to be progressed. There are 10 more that have, it seems, not responded. Some of them are actually Qatari state-owned as well, like Qatar Airways and Qatar Energy. Particularly in those 2 cases, I presume you're not overly surprised that, perhaps given their own relationships with the Qatari state, and I mean it is state owned, that perhaps they would be reluctant to speak out on
it. Yeah, so we've had 4 positive responses, and there's about another 10 who didn't respond to our letters, and that includes a mix of brands like Hyundai but also others, as you said, Qatar Airways and then others from China and India and elsewhere. And I guess what we would say is that they have the same response, whether they are linked to the Saudi state, the Qatari state or not, or whether they are linked to whether they're private companies in their own countries. They have the same responsibilities under international human rights standards, that they should support this, that they should put pressure on. It's a risk to their brand, and we think they need to speak out as well. So very much hope that they can do so before the tournament.
And would you be hopeful also that some of the ambassadors, so Qatar 2022 has had a number of very high profile ambassadors as well. I presume you'd also be calling and urging them to also speak out, not just in terms of promoting the World Cup, which is what they're actually being paid to do, but to actually highlight or at least speak out about some of the lingering issues that we've talked about.
Yeah, I think it's really important, because there are well-known individuals with huge profiles who are making a lot of money. I mean, paid a lot of money to promote the country, and I think it's important that they realize the profile they've got and can can also provide fair, honest assessment of some of the other challenges. We would certainly encourage, whether it's David Beckham or others, to also be raising human rights issues, whether that is about migrant workers' rights, whether that's LGBT rights or other issues, as part of their discussion on the tournament, because they are so well known, they have such big reach, and what they say is important, and we hope they can be allies.
Yeah, and for future World Cups, and this is the final point, for future World Cups, and the next one, which is hosted by 3 countries, the USA, Canada, and Mexico in 2026, there is a human rights criteria brought into the assessment when the bid was being made for that one, and for any future ones. That wasn't the case with Qatar when it was being assessed in 2010. That being said, when we look at what happens after the World Cup, and obviously it moves on to other countries, but in regards to the situation in Qatar with Cafala, with reforms, how concerned are you that once the eyes of the world move on, that some of the pace of reforms or the urgency of it will either stall, or maybe there might even be a reversal? Is that a major worry for you, that perhaps with the natural way that, I guess, the eyes of the world move, that's a major concern going forward?
Yeah, that is a concern. I think we've always felt that the World Cup provided a sort of a window of opportunity, or a spotlight, an ability to shine a spotlight on conditions and drive progress. Now, I would say that the Qatar has said it will continue the reforms, and it will continue work with the International Labour Organization to do so. I think many of the reforms are in their own interests as well, and so I do believe that they will continue. I guess I have my questions about whether they, without the sort of international scrutiny, what the level of enforcement will be and what the level of implementation will be. And I think it's really important that we do keep an eye on. So Amnesty will keep reporting on Qatar and monitoring it. And Qatar will continue to want to be a global hub for whether it's media, for sport, or for many other things. It won't disappear into the limelight entirely. It will bid for future sporting events, and it will be hosting major conferences. And so I think we do have to keep watching what's happening, and keep encouraging Qatar to move, and criticizing when necessary, and praising when deserved, because the World Cup isn't the end, and it's a big opportunity to do something lasting for workers. But we've got to obviously make sure it lasts.
Okay, thank you very much, Stephen Cockburn. It was a pleasure to speak to you, and obviously we'll be following what is happening in Qatar on and off the pitch over the next 2 months.